from services to students. So again, the act does not compel us to treat students. It also doesn't relieve us of the burden of being responsible with our families and trying. And probably through our efforts, most of those families are going to say, sure, I'd love for my kid to do that, that's fine. So let's talk about some ethical decision making. I'm going to go through a process that the American Psychological Association kind of suggests in some of their research is helpful. In your packet, we are going, at the end of this section, we're going to look at some scenarios. Some are real scenarios that we've worked through in our practice. And you have an ethical decision-making tool here. I've given you 4 copies. We're going to run through 3 scenarios. So this, you have an extra one to take with you. You know, Robin, anytime I've talked to Robin, he always says, put a paper in the file, Sarah. So lawyers like that documentation in the file. This is a nice systematic way that you can just make sure that you've addressed everything that you need to be really thoughtful about. So we have 9 steps to ethical decision making, and we'll go through each of these. So the first one is identifying the problem. So the problem is generally not the client wants counseling. The problem is there's a barrier to counseling in some way. So the problem, so for example, John's parents refused to sign consent for counseling. That would be an identified problem to look at ethically. Another example might be John's parents lost the paperwork for the 3rd time. Right? Somebody's laughing. I know what you mean. Right? And so they may be like, yeah, I don't really know where it is. And at that point, okay, so the paperwork is the barrier. So now we don't necessarily have to drive to John's house and sit with the family and help them fill it out. This can be somewhat freeing. Develop possible solutions to the problem. So consider the solutions. What are the options? So in the case of unreturned paperwork, now we know Act 35, minor can sign consent. You could have the parents come in for a meeting. There are other ways you can do that. This is that brainstorming. What are the possible solutions? We also want to consider the possible consequences, thinking of right now and in the future. So if we have a barrier to consent and we're concerned about the parent's reaction, or we have concerns, making sure that we're looking at what is the barrier now. If we have a student that may go into crisis, so that we need to really assess further to see what the depth of the depression is, what are the potential risk factors here, where this is a client at risk, but not to the risk that we would engage emergency services or be free to, for example, enact our right under EMTALA to get immediate treatment. We need to think about what could happen as a result of each of these solutions that we've proposed. Consider the significance of the context and the setting. So Robin talked about what would a reasonable person do in your situation. So given your the ethics code that guides your profession, the significance of the situation, the where, consider these elements as an additional information about what's in the best interest of the client. Remember, ultimately, we're to do no harm. So that's really an important thing to keep in mind. Identify and utilize ethical and legal resources. This is about not going out on a limb by yourself. So if you're in private practice, don't go out on a limb by yourself. Make sure that you consult with colleagues, supervisors. Your liability insurance generally includes ethical consult as part of that. Legal consult as part of your benefit. APA does that. They are a good attorney is always important, that you have a good working relationship with an attorney for any of those legal issues, especially if there's something sticky like custody. Make sure that you have a working knowledge of your ethics code and any administrative rules that exist in your organization. So that's your administrators making sure that there's really clear and transparent information so that you can document who you have talked with and what their consultation was, so that as you ultimately make a decision, it's a well-informed one. This is a really important one. Consider your own personal beliefs and values. What do you value about counseling? What do you believe about mental health? What do you believe about families who have secrets? Are there families that maybe in your practice you've seen for years, especially if you're in a school, that have been hands off, and now these students might have access to some really incredible supports that could enhance their life and make them suffer less? So, and then what do I believe are our students' rights? The one I really want you to consider is, where do you have blind spots? Where is your stuff potentially going to be in the way of making strong, student-informed, ethical decisions that balance parents' rights, balance your responsibilities of your setting that you're in, and also make sure that students have access to counseling. Taking all those factors together, you're going to choose and implement a course of action. Rarely do these situations have a clear yes or no, so you may head in a direction, recognize there's some things that came up that you didn't anticipate, and have to readjust. To be flexible in your decision making, and we're looking for the best course of action given all the factors. Remember to document decision making, people involved, sources of information, supervision, and collaboration. Assess outcomes. How's it going? Is it going well? Is it going poorly? Continue to seek that supervision and collaboration. Notice those contextual factors and be ready to assess outcomes in honest ways. Implement those changes as needed. Be flexible and adaptive. Our goal is to do no harm, intentionally or unintentionally, to the best of our abilities, and implement changes when things are no longer effective. All right, here's our first situation. So you're going to use, I encourage you to use the template that I gave you. Certainly don't have to, but here's your first situation. This is actually a situation out of our practice that we grappled with this year. You're seeing an 8-year-old male student at school. Mom and dad are newly separated and legally share joint custody. Collateral information and your own suspicion says there's been domestic violence in the parental relationship. In a parent session held in your office without the student, dad gets mad, calls you incompetent, and says you're fired. You cannot see my son anymore. He storms out of the session. Mom falls apart. We spend the rest of the session helping her calm. She's clear she supports counseling for her son. Further, the dad calls the school and tells the principal, sorry, I have that error, that counseling with you isn't a good fit, and he expects you will not see the student at school anymore. So the next part of that is you run into the student in the hallway that next week, and the student says, when do we get to see each other again? All right, so turn in your tables. I know, Michelle's like, that's sad, that's sad. Turn in your tables, take some time, ethical decision making, and then we'll report out. Don't forget to use your ethics codes.
Jim's checking out the loud noise.
Yeah, what's the loud noise?
I don't know. I was like, I can kick the wall, see if that'll help.
It's like right there. Extra pen. I have extra pens. There's markers, but you have bad pen. I know, I didn't have to use it the way I thought I was going to. So.
At least clear enough. Well, there's one services, mom does, kid does.
So this is now.
Yeah.
Yep, today.
I can use my first.
So what services?
The public doesn't want to. Okay, that's one level.
That is
Yeah.
You cannot see my son, you're right. I think it could be collision or death, right? It's not clear from that, right?
Yep.
If fires bad. It could be an issue.
I mean, it's a typical relationship.
Sure.
But may not. So there may be another.
Yeah.
So this is part of why.
So that could be an
Because Jen's going out as a private practitioner, and she does really differently. There's a director of guidance who's probably going to deal with some of these things, and Jen is probably going to go to Ryan and be like, Sarah, right?
You're
And
still
then,
on.
what?
You're still on.
Thanks. Right. That wasn't a bathroom.
Yeah.
First thing.
Other possible solutions would be meeting with the dad.
So you're smoking, right?
Yeah.
Is it like heater or something?
Are they generated?
Oh, is the electricity?
They can't shut, no, it runs in the day.
Oh, how long is it gonna run for? Oh, that's not too bad.
Thanks.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so it was a huge failure.
The solution is.
It runs every day.
The solution is nothing. Or it could be for, for like.
So it's probably already been like 5 years.
I thought it was a truck going by, but I think it's a truck underneath it.
I wasn't quite like that.
Can you hear me?
Look at honey. Look where I'm.
They got like, oh.
I'm not getting up until I'm done.
As practices.
It's the standard in both schools.
Right, right. But plus,
Very conservative. Yeah. Yeah.
I should say at least that's been the standard in practice. I can't say that that's what the.
I ran into my final email from Matt saying,
yeah, he's
Kelly.
It's also you're not addressing the We're just reporting out, right? There's not much.
Do a better job.
Yes.
to discuss
Take it
all
in, you know.
considerations. Your dad said something.
I thought you were streaming.
Give us someone be the spokesperson for your table and just give us a quick overview of your process, the factors that are involved, key things, and any decisions that you came to. How about this first table? Someone, ready, go.
All right, I'll go halfway through. Okay, so the problem we came up with was dad fired counselor, mom wants counseling, kid wants counseling, dad doesn't.
Okay.
Possible solutions, it could be that the dad just doesn't want that counselor, so we could refer to a different counselor.
Okay.
Possible meet with dad and meet with the principal to discuss the issue further to see, what it was that was going on. You could keep seeing the kid because the mom gave permission, or you could not see the kid. Or we came up with dad needs counseling, but then I furthered that mom and dad both need individual counseling to deal with this situation.
Yes, they do.
Yeah. So, and then really when we got down to possible consequences, dad could change his mind, dad could get more irrational. There could have to be consequences with the kids. So things could get better or things could get worse, basically, for any of the things we came up with. The role of context setting, we really were kind of looking at, like, what was it in the conversation that made dad get so mad? Like, what was that piece that made him blow up? And so that could be a possible area to fix that issue, to get dad back on board again. And you're up.
We didn't get past that.
And we didn't get past that part. So there it is.
Okay, great. Thanks for that first part. What else? Anything else? No? Okay. All right, good job. Thank you. How about you guys?
We pretty much had the exact same thing that they had. Refer out.
We need 2 more days.
Need 2 more days and more food and a couple drinks. Okay. All right, great. In the back.
Well, we all come from different perspectives. So, in the case of the school, a different administrator gets involved. If there's other possible avenues for a student to have services, whether it's different counselors or SAT or whatever it happens to be, there might be some attempts at mediation to see really what's going on. But there could be a transfer still to try and meet those kids' needs just with a different provider. Some of this depends on how long that relationship has been. There's lots of different factors that are in there. But we basically talk about, from our different perspectives, and different ways we might be able to still try to meet the students' needs. Not really taking into account Act 35 in any way, but just how we would do so, regardless of today's event.
Right. Well, an interesting kind of part of the conversation, I think, right here in his administrative role, and me having been through a few principles kind of thing, is understanding the clinical needs of the kids may not match with the administrative needs of the school.
That's a great point, Chris. Absolutely.
So,
yeah.
And but that needs to be considered in a school's content.
Absolutely. So a great example, certainly the theme of flexibility, and how important the context was. So, how long has the relationship been going on? How long was this relationship?
About 2.5 months.
Okay, so relatively new for the setting, but 8 weeks, if we look at that's enough to solidify a relationship. So definitely that. Notice a couple tables had almost exactly the same option. So there's comfort in that to know that as you look at the issues and you filter them through the information that you've received today, you are probably going to come up with very similar responses as other reasonable professionals would. So certainly some additions in the school setting of administrators. For those of us that work in schools, we're a guest in that house. And so that deep perspective, making sure that the school, our contacts at the school are well informed of what students' needs are, and that we can collaborate when we're those contractors. So great job. All right, here's your second one. 13-year-old presents for on-site school-based counseling. Again, I'm going to leave this broad. You can come at that from what that means in your role. The student is dealing with issues of sexual orientation and came into your office only because of the sticker on your door identifying your office as a safe space. The student self-identifies as struggling with issues surrounding sexual orientation. As an ethical counselor, you provide a warm, welcoming opportunity for your client to explore these issues. Becomes apparent the teen is struggling with significant anxiety and depression and needs more significant, and I'll add longer term, mental health services. You would like to bring the student's family into the counseling to help the student. You ask the student refuses. 3 days later, the student's mother calls you to talk about her kiddo, right? So again, work in your tables for a few minutes. Remember, Act 35, consent that we talked about, informed consent, and then we'll report out. Okay.
So how does the mother know about
So I listen a lot when mother calls.
Yeah,
I'm
right.
like, hi, how are you? I can let mom know. What's up? Where is she? This doesn't say where is she at. She wanting. So.
Just some more about that.
Yeah. There was, well, there's some unanswered questions to be able to, kind of like, so we went down both roads. It sounds like from what's being said about the sexual orientation, the depression, that, significant, that's probably more than a 6 to 8 week mandate. So the next would be to have a conversation with the mom, prepare administration and the team about what's going on. Also talking to the student about the fact that, what options are, but that mom called. And so we are going to have to talk to mom. This is what we're going to say, and try to include the conversation to be more open, be transparent about what we can offer, what referrals can be made. If mom's on board, then it goes down one track. If mom's not on board, then it can go down another track. So we kind of looked at all of that.
Great. Okay. Thanks. In the back.
So we were kind of the same. And actually, this is not an unusual scenario, because I'm in an environment of a lot of self-referrals where, the friend brings a kid out. And they say, do my parents need to know? I don't want my parents to know. I'm like, well, yeah, they do. And then we talk about the same thing here. I would not call the mother before. We wouldn't call the mother before we talked with the student about this happened. I was also curious that the mother knew to call you. Okay, where'd that come from? Because, I'm not the school counselor. That's not the point of contact usually. So I didn't know what to make of that.
Yeah.
But that it would really, the initial would be to prepare the student to be cognizant of the fact that the mother's going to be communicating.
Great. Any others? Right, table up front. What did you come up with?
I think we came up with a lot of the same. And what we did come up with the mom calling was just doing a lot of active listening, and not disclosing much. We also talked about the fact that having the conversation with the kid about what, if anything, can be. There's a lot there. I think you might actually be able to appease the mom a little bit by maybe dealing with the anxiety or the depression and staying away from the sexual orientation, right? So a lot about the confidentiality piece that you have, there's nothing up there that is self-harm or homicidal ideation. So the confidentiality piece protects us.
Yep, absolutely. As I was walking around, a couple things I heard that I really appreciated was one, maybe the student actually changed their mind since they saw you and they told the parent. Maybe it's coincidental. And so I heard, listen and understand. I also heard another table talking about going to get that student and saying, hey, just want to let you know, your mom called me. What do you think she's calling about? And oh gosh, she's calling about my math grade. If that's something, you'd be the point of contact. So then that's a whole different conversation than I told her I was in counseling. Oh, great. So you changed your mind. How can that be helpful? And then we have a whole different conversation. So the timing kind of creates an assumption, and making sure that we've circled around to make sure there's good communication, that we totally understand, as to our knowledge. I also heard someone else say, maybe mom is calling to say, hey, I really need you to see my kid. And they don't really want to see anybody. Can we figure out how to do that? And maybe that's going on too, that there's that, the cross of that there. All right, so great job. Last one, and then we're gonna finish up. A 14-year-old student walks into your office on a Wednesday afternoon. So this is a little bit more geared to the private sector. You didn't have a client, so you inquire about how you can be helpful. The student says he heard he can, sorry, the not should not be there, get counseling without his parents' permission. Since his friend sees you, he says he's heard you're okay. He's speaking about his rights under Act 35. How do you proceed? So kind of talk this out in your tables, and again, a little bit more geared to the private sector. I think in our practice, this could happen with a lot of traffic, walking traffic that comes up and down from Spalding is our close high school. So I could see that happening. I could see that happening off Main Street. So those of you in the private sector that are kind of in a very accessible place, this is something possible that could happen, especially if you see adolescents. So talk that out for just about 5 minutes and then we're going to move on.
This is your
So
one.
kind of what we were talking about was that you have to say,
Yeah, you
that's
want
like,
it.
It's a gym set, and then here's my work one. These are all things I need to attend to, and everything else. Look, they even have former employee subcategories.
But maybe it's actually billing situation and you do,
Oh.
you can access actually a billing person, so you can access the billing information without knowing how to bring it.
But yeah, same thing, right?
But then
Like,
the
oh, I can't
statement
work
goes
there,
home
but
and
that
it's
was
no.
Heard a lot of great discussion. All right, let's start in the back. What did you guys come up with in the back?
We gave it to Jen.
We gave it to Jen. Woo! Go, Jen!
I do great one-on-one.
Okay.
So, as the therapist of our group, the private practice. I think it really comes down to inquiry and just having the conversation, talking with the students, trying to kind of get a little deeper. Also, maybe sharing your own preferences. You know, it is my preference when I work with students to work to have consent, and so that really is my preferred preference. What is it that is bringing you here that doesn't want you having me talk to your parent or getting consent, and just kind of playing that out. There also is nothing necessarily that mandates that you have to. So, but through that process, that you kind of play that out a little bit. There's lots of other possibilities that could have brought that student to your office, and that might make it appropriate or might make it not appropriate. So,
great.
So we just kind of talk through a lot of those things through.
Yep, great. So again, this is somewhat of an open-ended situation because somebody walks in off the street and you happen to be available. You don't know what you're walking into. So, great job of being flexible about maybe not assuming, but asking about, tell me about your family, and then certainly going in that direction of informed consent and parent involvement, and then kind of playing it out and seeing where it goes. So great job. This table of parents.
We were talking about just providing more information and then saying up front that, because your friend kind of referred you here, I wouldn't be able to see you. That could get a little murky. But then the information about kind of what their rights are, and then, this is kind of a new thing, don't know how to work out, and then here's some referrals. So more probably like a consult, and maybe not even really getting into a lot of their history because that would be beyond our role at that point.
Yeah, the further we get into it, the more it establishes this provider-client relationship, even though in Vermont we don't have to have informed consent until that third session. It's still we can certainly be on the hook, and it's mindful to make sure there's no safety issues, mindful to make sure there's not something dangerous happening or something like that. But then I like how you said consider it maybe a consultation, and then some information, and then taking in those, who could, how could we proceed from here? So great. And this table right here.
Similar, one, inquire about current services that they may have been using at their school or other community resources. Another solution would be to, super brief assessment to just identify, just the real basics to get some information, some listening, and then buy some time. It's 5 o'clock, and
you gotta get your kid from daycare and
those were the possible solutions that we had in addition to some that we've heard already.
Great. So great. Again. A lot of active listening, asking questions, some limit setting, making sure that you are not in maybe necessarily engaging beyond a consultation, but also the things that need to happen. Who's this kid? What's their name? What's their date of birth? Where do they live? Some basic information gathering so that you don't have a random somebody walk in your office and then they leave and there's a bad outcome and hey, didn't you see that kid yesterday at 4? What's their name? I don't know. And and then there's a bad outcome. And that would you be on the hook? Who knows, right? But again, saying this kid came in here with the intent to seek services, I probably need to make sure I've got enough information captured that I've done diligence and screened. So great job.
We also talked about if we did just go, oh yeah, let's do Act 35, told them about the risks, and they were like, okay, let's do it. And, you just pay me $10 a week or whatever. And then the parents find out, and then it's a mess.
Yeah.
So we went that scenario too.
And I like that, we consider, what if we just went that direction? And few things that we do in counseling go that textbook, that it just all works out. It's because there's families and systems and there's stuff. So that Act 35 is a nice sort of ace to have in our pocket when we need it. It allows us flexibility when there aren't other options, but there are also other best practices. It is best practice to get informed consent from a family, and that's a great opportunity. That's just a great best practice to continue. When a student says no, then we need to figure out why and see if we can at some point merge that. And then again, working with those building policies that you have and policies on your own practice to figure out what I feel like I can ethically do. So one of the things that, counseling in our culture is still a reactive service. And it is still something we do when we feel the most broken, when we can't figure out how to fix something. It is not preventative medicine at this point. And I look forward to when it becomes a part of the yearly health activities that we do. I want half points for yearly EAP visits, but we're not there yet. So one of the things, if you work in a school district, is more work on this idea of a culture of wellness, a culture of wellness. We have healthy choices in our cafeterias. We're teaching students. I sat in a sex ed class at Williamstown actually the other day with Lisa Page, and I was amazed. I was like, this was the best class ever! And her students were doing amazing work, and she held incredible space with these kids, and they were learning so much about their bodies and doing some hard stuff, and there wasn't a red face in the crowd, and I was just so proud of that kind of education that's going on to support students to make healthy choices. And this is one of the things as mental health providers that we can begin making that change. And Act 35 can certainly help us, but when presented as a part of the services to help students and meet them where they are developmentally and in their wellness, this can really be something that we can see some real change. So, our current methods for counseling, parents are those gatekeepers. Perhaps more so in the elementary years when school counselors are still calling to say, I would like for your student to meet with me one-on-one. I would like them to participate in my group. And Lisa, I've heard you talk more about this is just part of the services that we provide. So I appreciate that sort of broad language that educates parents that this is just what we do. This is what we do here. The other, for more extended services, parents give consent, and then that transfers into the private sector. So it's a handoff, the referral is a handoff, those private practitioners take it from there. And then in a few circumstances, school counseling is part of the educational curriculum. It's just part of what they do. Certainly school counselors limited by time and ethics codes to non-diagnosed brief short-term treatment, and then also limits to areas of practice that are specialty. So intense work with victims of domestic violence. There's just not the time and the consistency. And Sandra, I appreciated what you said about, and we have all these vacations and summers, and there's such a service interruption that can I even ethically be that main counselor? It's really challenging. So when we as counselors come into the school, some of those barriers that we experience, parents not returning paperwork, up until now that has limited us to begin starting, so that depending on the counselors that work in your school, that allows us to proceed differently. Go ahead.
On that note, so could the kids fill out the paperwork, sign it for themselves, and then get a phone okay from the parents, do you think?
So I think so. I think, best practice again
would be
parents, and I think that's the first call. I think parents could be given an option. Do you want, under the law, I could have your kid fill out this paperwork, or I could send it home to you. You could send it back to me. In our office, we do it all electronically, so that's sometimes really easy for parents. So I think, again, those best practices, stepping down those same channels that we normally do until there's a resistance, and then exploring resistance and how can we work around that. The parental refusal, we've talked tons about that today. And the other would be family communication, where that was working with a family the other day and I said, is there another phone number? There's like no message set up, and it just rang. They were like, oh, she'll eventually pick up. I'm like, oh boy. So there's that sort of, the communication just dies. So we can assume that's a no just because there's not an active engagement with that. So we could send letters. There are other ways we could try to communicate to get that consent. Or again, we could work with an Act 35 to do that. So as we've talked about today, we can have students sign their own consent forms. Robin did a great job of saying, what you have an 8-year-old sign needs to be appropriate for that. So it needs to probably not be 2 pages, single-spaced, 11-point type with lots of really complicated wording, because would we reasonably expect an 8-year-old to understand that? Or would we reasonably expect an 8-year-old to say, yes, you can talk to my mom. And yes, I want to come and meet with you. And try to figure out how we do that language a little differently. We know that parents no longer have the right under the law to block consent. We talked a lot about how to manage that ethically, how to balance that with rights of parents to be involved and that we want them involved, but also how to ensure that students with need also get the service that they need. Concerns that we need to continue to balance: relationships with the family, especially if those are already fragile. So we have lots of ways to communicate compassionately. We have lots of ways to collaborate, and making sure that we are working as closely as we can with those families to get that consent in ways that acknowledge the fear, acknowledge what the concerns are, and then continue to meet the needs of the students. Billing concerns are going to continue to be a problem. Parents often need to give insurance information that may be held by the school, so making sure there's a collaborative information sharing agreement or consent, or parents can give that information on the phone. That's a really important piece to make sure that there's not a violation of FERPA accidentally. And then the question from the private sector is sometimes there's co-pays and co-insurance that the insurance payment is not going to happen automatically. It's not going to be in full. So those are things to kind of consider for clinicians. Again, that culture of wellness. One suggestion would be send out letters to families at sometime during the school year, talking about a culture of wellness, talking about services that are available. And accessible to students. So creating something that really looks at your district, that your administration feels supported by, that also informs parents and students. Being clear about Act 35, that would be great. And yet, does it apply to all students? Can we respectfully hold that we now have this option, and yet that 1 to 5% is probably the only students that we're going to have to work on that, because most parents want the best for their student. They don't want anything to happen. So we're keeping this in perspective is really important. Encouraging parents to call if they have concerns. Something to consider, when we first decided that we needed to have a workshop about Act 35, every single school and person that I connected with had no idea about Act 35. There were no exceptions. So the counselors that you have working in your buildings that are in private practice may reasonably not know about this. So it's really important that you either have a conversation with them or ask them to be educated about that. Because the other thing you don't want is you don't want parents that are unhappy because a counselor takes a little bit more of a cowboy approach to it and wants to see students without consent. And as soon as you hand that student off to that family, or that counselor, you may not know about the process of consent. You may not know how that's going. So that's a really important thing to make sure that your counselors are educated and that you have been clear about your expectations of those counselors and your expectations of how they're going to interact with your students and your families. Don't assume that. One of the options that I heard coming out of Massachusetts is that in one circumstance, there was a collaborative agreement with a counseling practice where the school didn't budget for the cost of hiring counselors, but they budgeted a certain amount for co-pays and some co-insurance. So it allowed them to have on-site mental health support available Monday through Friday, 8 to 4. And that way all students had access, but then it was a much less expense for anybody. And counselors were willing to really commit to that because they weren't going to have 50% non-payment. So they could guarantee that they were going to get paid, and they handled all the billing and all the insurance, and then just billed the school for any balances they couldn't collect from parents. So that's an example of a collaborative model that could be really sustainable in Vermont. Remember to stay educated. Robin gave us some great options about that. Again, insist that providers you work with are educated about Act 35. Don't make assumptions. Make it very clear what you expect from them and how you expect them to handle informed consent with your families. Strongly recommend that you be proactive in this. Whether your district decides to have a policy or decide not to, at least you have expectations for how you're going to address Act 35 issues. If you're in the private sector, updating forms for different levels of understanding and client need would be an important piece too. I will send you, if you would like, Robin's slides and Caroline's slides electronically today, so you have that information. I think that's some great information, and we weren't able to get it in the packet, so I'll send that. You can see that we have our presentation today recorded, so we do still have CEUs that are available. So if other counselors would like that, they can contact us, and we're happy to make sure that they get the training on that. Any last questions before we go? Anything that we didn't cover? No? All right. Thank you for coming today. Nice to meet all of you. We appreciate you. Your certificates are there. Please do your evaluation form in the back of your packet. Please trade that for your certificate. We won't hog tie you at the door, but that's really important for us for our CEU organization.
With content.
And when Friday.